Professor Ghosal will speak on the topic The Aurobindo, a revised history of English poetry and a new poetry. Over to you, sir.
So that was a wonderful lecture from Professor Dhananjay Singh, and I learned a lot from him, in fact, and it was really very fruitful. I hope the listeners have got the issues, the points he discussed in detail. And I must admit that I haven't heard such a rich lecture in the last 2 or 3 years. It was so nice. So let me turn to Sri Aurobindo from where Anandabardhan left. Now Sri Aurobindo goes back to the ancient days, the Vedic period, the early Vedic period. And he says it was codified maybe 3000, 3500 years ago, but the tradition was there even 10,000 years ago and even beyond that. That he says in the Isha Upanishad, that the tradition was even much older than what we know. It was codified later, these ideas of poetry as mantra of the real. So poetry in the past was sight, was vision, revelation, a direct sight of truth, and it was thoroughly incantatory. It was sung, as Plato has said in Ion. He has used a beautiful phrase, divine enthusiasmos. It was just that the poets of the Upanishads, the Vedic period, they sang, they just saw and sang, and it was not philosophy, it was not teaching, preaching, thinking, moralizing. It was a completely different thing from what we know today as poetry. So Sri Aurobindo critiques the later development as poetry is not a notch girl of the mind, and it does not spin fictions, but it is a direct vision of truth, of the basic, the thing that is inside, that is above. And he says that the word kavi in classical Sanskrit, in the days of Anandabardhana, in the days of Kalidasa, in classical Sanskrit, the word kavi meant any maker of prose or verse. But in ancient times, the word kavi meant the person who just saw and sang. He had no other business. So this is the basic difference between the word kavi in classical Sanskrit and in ancient Sanskrit. And while talking of and explaining Anandabardhan in the future poetry, which is Aurobindo's masterpiece, he started it in 1917 and ended it in 1920, serializing it in his journal, The Arya. And he was immediately influenced by the symbolist movement, W.B. Yeats and others, and also James Cousin's book, New Ways in English Literature, which came to him for review. And Sri Aurobindo got his clue. The first chapter of the future poetry was a review of the book, uh, James Cousin's New Ways of English Literature, which I have just reprinted, re-edited after 103 years, because it was lying in the dusty corner of a shelf in Pondicherry Sri Aurobindo Library, and somehow I got a copy, or we got a copy, and we did try to give a good presentation of what Cousins meant in our introduction. So mantra is incantation, vision, revelation, the direct vision of truth. Sometimes magic, as you see in Keats's magic casements opening on the foam of perilous seas and the fairy lands forlorn. And sometimes it is the bare vision of truth. The winds come to me from the fields of sleep, as Wordsworth says in Immortality Ode. So Sri Aurobindo explains Dhani in a chapter in the future poetry, and he says Dhani is, as Sir has said, it has a deeper meaning, and it together taking the substance and the inspiration, the sound, it makes Rasadhani. And Sri Aurobindo says even it goes beyond that. So he interprets Anandabardhan and Abhinavagupta and he leaves them behind in search of something better, and that he calls mantra, the great sound effect which creates that. That is why Sri Aurobindo says rhythm is the essential quality of poetic expression. Without rhythm, inner or outer, there can be no great poetry. And uh, then Sri Aurobindo, it is not true that the future poetry is Sri Aurobindo's final vision of aesthetics or poetics, because even though we call him an avatar of the divine, Sri Aurobindo is many things: a psychologist, an avatar of the divine, an anthropologist, a philosopher, and a poet. And still, we must admit that he had some limitations when he was writing the future poetry. And he admitted it later in his letters to K.D. Setna, his poetic disciple. And in those letters of the 30s, his entire poetics, his theory of poetry comes out clearly, but not fully in the future poetry. Why? I asked R.Y. Deshpande, perhaps the greatest living Savitri scholar in the planet. He's still alive. He's 90, and he's a living encyclopedia of Savitri. He said, Goutam, it's not true that future poetry is Sri Aurobindo's final vision of his theory of poetry, because he could not express. And Sri Aurobindo says in his letters to Setna, the mantra which I have tried to explain in the future poetry. And then it becomes clear in the letters when he speaks of the planes, the spiritual planes of poetry, starting from the higher mind, then the illumined mind, then the intuition, and finally the overmind, the last stage of the mind. And beyond that, it is the supermind which is not yet been expressed. But something of the supermind percolates into the overmind. That is why we have received texts like the Bhagavad Gita and other great texts where the supermind has percolated into the overmind, because the overmind, beyond the overmind, man cannot express. So in future poetry, Sri Aurobindo could not tell that it is by the touch of the overmind poetry becomes mantra. Then let me come quickly to the issue of the revised history of English poetry. I have explained the point of theory, which is as Sri Aurobindo says, first it is, as Anandavardhan says, it is the sound, then the thought, then the sense, and finally it is the soul which listens. And this aspect of the soul is not clarified in neither in Anandabardhan nor in Abhinavagupta. They reach the point of nada and sound, deeper sound, and something great, but they can't specify that this is the soul's vision of truth that comes through rasa. As Sir has rightly pointed out, rasa is consciousness. It's a wonderful lecture I have heard today, and it has illumined my own thinking. So now let us come back to the theory, to the history, why do I call it a revised history of English poetry? Because Sri Aurobindo keeps 70% of the traditional material of history. You will have the Legui, you will have that Kazamian, you will have in it Ricket, you will have in him the most recent historian, Samson and others. But there is an extra something in Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the poetry written in England by the English poets. Now, this mantric poetry is not religious poetry. It may be, but not always, because it has nothing to do with religion, because I have said that religion is not spirituality. Religion is some outer rituals. Spirituality is an awakening into a new being, a new life, a new consciousness. And this poetry will speak of that, and it will come in the form of lyrics. Aurobindo traces the lyric. And if you go back to Whitman in 1855, when he writes Leaves of Grass, it was lyric as epic, or epic as lyric, because Rabindranath says that even if the epic is back, it has to be through the form of lyric. Lyric is the heightened expression of the human soul. That is why Leaves of Grass is called an epic, a new epic, because the form is lyrical, but the status is epical. Now, why is it a revised history? Because it starts from Chaucer, and he exactly points out that Chaucer is, and it all relates to the consciousness. Chaucer is a vital poet because he is writing from the pranastar, from the pranic level, and he writes stories of from the prana, from the vital being. And it becomes interesting for the common man, for the mass. It is very interesting. Then slowly it passes on to the Elizabethan age, where we have Shakespeare. Now, Sri Aurobindo places Shakespeare among the greatest of poets. Sri Aurobindo chooses 11 poets for the utter first class. And in the first row, we have Homer, Vyasa, Valmiki, and Shakespeare. Why Shakespeare? He has nothing to do with mysticism. He has nothing to do with spirituality. So why Shakespeare? Why Shakespeare? Because in mantric poetry, or in poetry of incantation, as Sarah said, that there is something called uh, uh, vastu, the matter. The matter may be spiritual. The style separately may be spiritual in incantatory poetry, or both the matter and the style may be spiritual and may drag inspiration from the overmind. Now, these overhead aesthetics can also be called spiritual poetry. There is a synonym for overhead poetry, spiritual poetry. For mantra, it is either overmind or very high intuition. So this, in short, is Sri Aurobindo's structure of aesthetics. And when it comes to Shakespeare, he gives us a new aesthetics on Shakespeare. This is very, very rare, and very few people know this, that Sri Aurobindo is the best critic of Shakespeare from India, and alone among all the Indians, he has a new theory, a new aesthetics on Shakespeare. Very few people know this. Sri Aurobindo is a supreme authority on Shakespeare because he is not just a critic of Shakespeare, but he has a whole body of aesthetics on Shakespeare, which he has summarized in the Future Poetry in 2 chapters and in his letters later to K.D. Setna. So, then after Shakespeare, he passes on to the new age, the Romantic age, which he calls the poets of the dawn. And many of the things in Byron, Shelley, Keats, Wordsworth, Coleridge, many are the things Blake, he pairs Blake with Coleridge, not Wordsworth with Coleridge. He pairs Blake with Coleridge. And in many of these, there are some traditional elements, but there are certain leaps which are missing in the traditional history of English literature. That is the contribution of Sri Aurobindo. Because we speak of Keats's concept of beauty, and Sri Aurobindo says there is a gradation of beauty in Keats. It is not just one concept of beauty, there is a grade, and it is a gradually ascending grade in Keats's concept of poetry. The first is basically based in the sensuousness. We can't deny that. It is traditional and it is accepted. But Sri Aurobindo classifies 4 stages of Keats's concept of beauty. sensuous beauty, imaginative beauty, intellectual beauty, intuitive beauty, and then finally the ideal or the divine idea of beauty. So these things are Sri Aurobindo's additions with reference to his theory of poetry and to the evolution of the human mind, which takes the poetry to a greater height. And there are false relapse, as in the Victorian age, there is a drop in consciousness, except for Matthew Arnold. Unfortunately, Matthew Arnold couldn't see future. He was a backward-looking poet, but Arnold is a favorite poet of Sri Aurobindo. And even in his own early poetry, he imitated Arnold a lot. But there is a flop, a relapse, a lower consciousness in the Victorian age, a critical and argumentative, which is not poetry, because poetry is a direct vision of truth. The more you can reveal, poetry will go more and more towards the Vedic age. So in many ways, this poetry is not just a revival of a lost pin code of poetry. It's a lost pin code. The Vedic pin code is entirely lost. When Sri Aurobindo was reviving this ancient Vedic, this lost pin code of poetry, he also remembered that human mind is evolving and there will be no going back to the Vedas. And he chooses English poetry because in the English poetry, the lyric becomes the most powerful medium. And so he encouraged people to write in English because although in all regional literature of India, I can show you marks of mantra, inspired lines, either from the higher mind or from the illumined mind or from the intuition and finally from the overmind. Even Shakil Badayuni, the great Bollywood composer, did miraculous things and wrote miraculous lines for Noshad. So there is in regional poetry, in Bengali poetry also, we have seen not just Tagore, he is the greatest, but also in minor poets we see lines that are revealing, not just giving you philosophy, religion, which are not the topic of Sri Aurobindo. Religion is absolutely irrelevant to Sri Aurobindo's theory of poetry because he is seeking for the inmost being and the highest sources of consciousness where religion has no relevance. That is why we have so many devotees of Sri Aurobindo from all sects. We have Christian devotees of Sri Aurobindo, we have Muslim devotees of Sri Aurobindo, because Ajan is mantra, Ajan is incantatory verse. Rumi is related to Sri Aurobindo because Rumi had spoken of the evolution of man into a superspecies, which Sri Aurobindo later explains. So for Sri Aurobindo, the audience is very vast and there is no distinction. He is based on the Hindu scriptures. It is ascribed to the Hindus. But basically, he revolves around the three basic texts, the Vedas, the Upanishads, and the Bhagavad Gita. And all the three texts are not sectarian texts. Sri Aurobindo specifically points out the texts are meant for humanity, not just for them whom we call Hindus. That makes him a universal poet, and his theory has become acceptable, his philosophy has become acceptable because of this. So after Shakespeare, he comes to the Romantic, where he finds a great inspiration in Wordsworth, in Coleridge, in Blake, in Shelley, who is the most spiritual in substance, but also in Keats, who was the greatest of artists. And Sri Aurobindo says Blake cannot translate his comprehension into our experience. And T.S. Eliot has said the same thing in his small essay on Blake in the Selected Essays. Eliot says Blake works outside a conceptual framework of tradition. Eliot says Blake works outside a conceptual framework of tradition. That is why we cannot understand Blake. Aurobindo says, yes, he is complicated because he cannot translate his experience into our comprehension. and his images are not traditional. He breaks the traditional pattern of images. And after that, Sri Aurobindo comes to the 19th century. He begins with Whitman, who is his most favorite modern poet, apart from Tagore and Carpenter, because he's not talking of the 11 greatest poets whom he chooses for the utter first class. Vyasa, Valmiki, Homer, Kalidasa. Then in the next row we have Dante, Milton, Sophocles, Euripides, and others. In the last row, Goethe stands in solitary grandeur. He is not speaking of them. He is speaking of the return of mantra in poetry, and he starts with Walt Whitman, because Whitman had an access to Indian poetic tradition through the translations of Ram Mohan Roy. It used to be known as Roy literature in the 19th century. Whitman had a library close to his house and he could read everything in translation. But he took the essence. He did not memorize like T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot, unfortunately, had a great memory. He could only memorize. Whitman read and Whitman forget. He just got the essence of it. That is the sign of a great poet. And he discovered. Discovery is an important point relating to mantric poetry, of which Sri Aurobindo speaks. Then he comes to Rabindranath Tagore. And it's a nice day to remember Rabindranath Tagore. He says that Tagore, Whitman, Carpenter, they are the forerunners of the new spirit in poetry, the old new poetry. Old because it comes from the Vedas, from the Upanishads, and it is new because it is recreated in a new language, in English, in Bengali. Tagore has done wonderful things, especially his songs, where he has used the Rigvedic fire with wonderful effect, like in Aguner Porosh Mone Chhoa Prane E Jibon Punno Koro, which is very popular. So I quoted this, but there are plenty. Now, the point is, Sri Aurobindo reaches up to yets, because beyond that when he was writing the future poetry in 1917, and he was not interested in T.S. Eliot, because when T.S. Eliot was giving out his theory of poetry as an escape from emotion, as an objective art, as something passive, a passive attending upon the event, in a lonely corner of the globe, a lone, alienated recluse was giving us a theory of poetry which is going to change the entire complexion of future poetry. And naturally, Sri Aurobindo was serializing the future poetry just when Eliot was writing in 1919, Tradition and the Individual Talent, and two opposite theories of poetry. Somehow Sri Aurobindo was silent about Eliot, and also because Sri Aurobindo always answered in query against query. He never commented in his letters on anybody spontaneously, unless he was asked to clarify. When somebody asked him about D.H. Lawrence, he explained his problem, rating him as a great poet and also explaining his problem. But without any query, any letters, Sri Aurobindo would not open his mouth. That was the nature of that was his temperament. He wouldn't open his mouth against a contemporary or any other writer unless he is asked to comment. But he was very straightforward. He was very straightforward. He was a politician. At the same time, he was very straightforward and he wouldn't hide his mind. And so he comes to Yeats because Yeats was his contemporary, and he focuses on Yeats's early poetry, which he thinks to be the best as the new poetry, mantric poetry, the poetry of incantation. Many people decline, refuse to accept that Yeats's early poetry is great poetry. They focus on Yeats's later poetry because they follow Eliot's concept of the escape from emotion. But Sri Aurobindo focuses on Yeats's early poetry, the rose poems, that which speaks out spontaneously, because poetry comes out from the it's a spontaneous overflow from the fountainhead of the spirit. This is lyric poetry at its best, self-discovery and self-expression. And there he leaves behind all the past classical Sanskrit theoreticians in search of the pure quintessential Vedic idiom of poetry that is direct sight of truth. That is why much of Sri Aurobindo's poetry may appear to us as a bore, because his experience is not our experience. The sonnets, the great sonnets, many will feel them as bore, compressed, and they are speaking of experience, and we don't have. But Tagore is very close to us because he's a mystic. There's a difference between a mystic and a spiritual poet. Mysticism is in the borderline of poetry, and spiritualism is the direct sight of truth. And the direct sight of truth is a boredom for us because our consciousness is not there. Our consciousness can accept Tagore, Whitman, but not Sri Aurobindo. It will take time for people to reach Sri Aurobindo's poetics and Sri Aurobindo's poetry. So this is Sri Aurobindo's poetics, his theory of poetry as mantra, which he revived. And it's a dynamic revival because human consciousness is evolving. It won't go back to the Vedic poets, but we have the age of technology, we have the great of computers, mobiles, and we have to be different in a different age. But still, our expression may be different, but it will be a dynamic revival of the Vedic poetry in English and also in other regional languages. So this is why I call it a revival and a dynamic revival. And also his history of poetry is new in the sense that 30% of his stuff in the future poetry are interpretations with reference to his theory of poetry. That makes the future poetry such a great history of English poetry, which we tend to neglect. The first four chapters of the future poetry speak of Anandabardhan and Abhinavagupta and how it passes on to the Vedic poets. It goes back from the 8th century, 9th century to the old Vedic period. And then he starts from Chaucer and he ends with Yeats, then Whitman, and then he stops there because he couldn't revise. He tried 26 times to revise the future poetry, but he was unsatisfied and he said no to its publication during his lifetime. So the future poetry never came out during his lifetime. It came out only after his passing in 1953 with the permission of Nalinikanto Gupta. And then we see, even in his imperfections of arrangement, we can have, and that is why we have to interpret a lot what he wanted to mean by certain things in the future poetry. And our purpose will be to link the future poetry with the letters written to State 9 in the 1930s. Then we get a whole picture of Sri Aurobindo's theory of poetics and what is there, what he wants to mean when he speaks of the Romantics, the Victorians, Shakespeare, the Elizabethans. He has spoken on all. His one-page interpretation of Marlowe can generate 10 books. One page on Marlowe can generate 10 books. And he has accepted the fact that Marlowe is an author-oriented writer. There are two views on Marlowe, author-centric, and those who believe no, Marlowe was like Shakespeare. He was using negative capability. No, because even Una Ellis Farmer in his book 1927, Jacobean Drama, Ellis Farmer also accepts the fact that Marlowe is an author-centric writer. He is a subjective playwright. It's a unique thing, a playwright who is subjective. And it was much before Tagore, Yeats, and others. So Marlowe is a separate figure in the Elizabethan age. There are many subtler things in the future poetry, and that is left to the future scholars. The problem is people are quoting at random from Sri Aurobindo without trying to explain the things. My frustration is there that even the greatest names which you receive from northern India, from southern India, there is too much of quotation from Sri Aurobindo and too little of explanation. We have to explain them with reference to Anandavardhana, Abhinavagupta, and we have to explain them in terms of a new poetics. We have to explain what he means by certain phrases in the context of Tagore, Whitman, Yeats, and others. And it's a great field, it's a large field, and it's waiting to be explored. And one man can't do it. We are not sufficient. One man is not sufficient to do it. We all must start. We all must start working on this, how to explain what Sri Aurobindo exactly meant by his poetics, and by why do I call it a revised history of English poetry. Thank you. I will wait for your queries. I will then speak on the queries.
Thank you so much, sir, for such a wonderful speech. Poetry becomes a mantra and the soul listens to it. What a beautiful expression, sir. Thank you so much.